welcome back to the Fight Sites MMA podcast. Back again, another week of quarantine, which is gone on about a month so far. I think maybe a little bit longer than a month. So we are still here, still trying to cover MMA for the Fight Site. The sport, nothing really has changed. There is a possible card in 2 weeks headed by Ferguson Gaethje, which if it goes through, we'll talk about it. But as it stands right now, we are still in we can talk about whatever we want because there's literally nothing on our schedule. With me, as always, is my host, Sriram, and this week we have a very special guest, Julian Lung, fellow writer for the Fight Site and a good friend of ours. And he is here with us to discuss a topic that was actually given to us by a friend, Trayvon Coker. And his question was about, quote unquote, good fighters in MMA. Sriram and I often speak very frankly on Twitter about what we think of fighters, sometimes in the harshest of terms. And even very decorated and successful fighters, we may not really qualify as being that good or that great, depending on what we think of their styles and how we think they fight. So this week, we really want to talk about what it means to be a good fighter in MMA. You don't have to be the greatest, just what it means to be a good functional fighter who can fight against a variety of styles and just have success within their process. So Julian, right before we started recording, hello, you had a great point that I'm going to pitch to you because I think it's a good place to get us started. So please, in your estimation, what makes a good fighter?
Well, I think there's like two things generally. I think the first thing is being able to superimpose a game plan. I think like what makes a great MMA fighter, or like at least a good one, technically, is if you take their sort of style and game plan and then superimpose it on a lesser athlete. I think Dariush, which is like Sriram's man, probably is like the embodiment of that. He can generally play a good game plan that's generally going to give him the best chance to win, but he just is not an athlete whatsoever, and that's why he tends to lose. But he generally does have really great game plans and has a good style to support that. And I think secondly, what makes a good fighter is just being able to have control, right? MMA is all about control. If you control your opponent's game and you're able to superimpose yours, I think generally that's what makes a good MMA fighter, being able to control and just being able to move down technically.
Sriram wants to say something about Dariush. So please take it away, my friend.
I'm always in for that. I think Dariush is a good example because it kind of shows my criteria too, and I think I'll bring that up, which is process. But one, it's interesting because Dariush, he's beaten a bunch of better athletes. Guys like Drew Dober might be the best example because he knows what he's doing in every phase. And I think that's kind of overstated as a criterion for goodness, but you could say that he's never going to be caught out, just totally out of his element in any specific area of the game. I think, though, it might be a tiny bit reductive because I think the fighters that I point to when I say that they're bad tend to be super, super athletically reliant. But if you look at someone like Yoel Romero, I certainly wouldn't call him, or Kamaru Usman might be an even better example, because if you look at someone who's very, very dependent on their athleticism, those two might be among the top. And if you give their games to a lesser athlete, it wouldn't necessarily work. If you give Yoel Romero without the big power advantage he has and the explosiveness, if you give Kamaru Usman without just being, athletically dominating everyone in every phase, that might not necessarily work. But I certainly wouldn't call them bad. So I'm not, I think it's a mostly useful way to look at him, but I'm not entirely sure if I agree with it entirely.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead, Julian.
Yeah, I think MMA suffered from the biggest issue of just context, right? Like, what is the context of this fighter succeeding? Is it athleticism? Is it technique? Is it control? Or is it like a depreciation in skills? And I think in general, what makes MMA fighters good is you have to look at the whole context of the situation. Kamaru Usman, he's super athletic, but like you said, Sriram, if you bring it down to like a lesser athlete, it might not do as well. But he does control his opponents very well. They have to constantly adjust to his style, and we can call him a good athlete. And I think it's just contextually, how does this fighter do?
Yeah, and I think the athletic point is an interesting one because I think that we talk about the broad term, athleticism in the context of MMA. I feel like that can mean a couple of different things. Like it can be, guys like Kamaru Usman and Yoel Romero, where it's a very surface level. You can just look at them and see that they're etched from granite and they're, insanely strong and powerful and all these other things that you can sort of just tell. But I think that there are examples of fighters who are athletically dependent who you might not even think of as being such. The example that comes to mind is like Lyoto Machida. Who's someone who was very reliant on his speed, who was very reliant on his accuracy and his reaction time. You have someone like Stephen Thompson, who's also very reliant on his speed and his coordination. You might not generally think of these guys as being super athletically dependent, but they are in their own way. And so I like the idea, I like the axiom of scaling a fighter down, and you say, how would this fighter's game work in this person's body? So in this case, you get a broad sense of like, Rafael dos Anjos's game works broadly pretty well in the body of Beneil Dariush, who is a non-athlete. But then, the questions, they get a little bit more complicated. So if you have like, how does Kamaru Usman's game work in the body of a lesser athlete? Well, then you can get left with someone like, I don't know,
Ray Borg.
Ray Borg, yeah, Enrique Barzola. Both of which
I also tried to do that against Ivanov.
Well, that's an extreme example, but I think that creates a lot of interesting conversation pieces too, because generally fighters have something in their game that we can look to and we can evaluate and say this is something you should look for when you're trying to emulate, but it might not work for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's where it struggles for me because, yeah, I think because a lot of the fighters that I tend to enjoy watching in terms of, this guy is really good are like Beneil Dariush or like Rafael Assunção or Jussier Formiga, the prototypical, like, quote unquote hardcore favorite, which is
Brazilians.
Yeah. Okay. Beneil Dariush is not a Brazilian. He's just an honorary one.
I guess that's true. Yeah. Just 2 out of the 3.
I mean, just in general, the kind of guys who like, they play a game that's not aesthetically pleasing or even like, athletically particularly reliant, but it bears mention that that's not the only way to be good. And I don't think it makes sense to expect a super athlete, someone like, Yoel Romero, to be playing a game that pretends that they're not athletic, which I think is kind of the standard that we'd be holding people to if we expected all good fighters to have a game that translates to Beneil Dariush. But I think, yeah, it's just a weird way to think of it because I generally do agree. If you look at a fighter like Tyron Woodley, which I have a feeling we're going to be shitting on Tyron Woodley a lot in this episode, but if you look at a fighter like him, it's not going to translate down at all. If it's not even going to translate at the same weight class, it's not going to translate at a different weight class if you put him at that weight class. It's a very, very limited game with a narrow scope. But a lot of fighters who I do consider good have a similar problem, at least conceptually.
Julian, I sort of have a question for you in regards to what you said about control, because that can be taken a variety of different ways. I'm literally working on another MMA metagame piece as we speak. I have it open in my tabs, and I found myself talking a little bit about Jake Shields, and I wonder, yeah, right. I do sort of wonder about him because tactically he is a fairly, he's a decent fighter tactically. I think he does a lot of stuff that makes sense. So against George, he would, he would kind of try the inside leg kick. He would try to jab with George, or at least kind of paw at his eyes to take away George's jab. All that, like, that stuff makes sense. Mechanically, he is horrific, and that's when he can't. If he can't enforce a wrestling game, he'll just sort of, try to walk you into the clinch and hold you there. Jake Shields, and while Jake Shields has beaten some very good fighters, or at least some reputable names, I'm not sure how good I think he actually is. I'm not really sure where I stand with that, because his mechanics are so bad, and he's just, like, his idea of control is something that, ostensibly shouldn't score. And, like, that is just sort of the game he plays if he can't grapple with you. I don't know.
Yeah, I think control isn't just necessarily just, I think, grappling. I think, you can obviously have a lot of control in striking. I think control in the broader context of what I'm saying is that when you're controlling your opponent, you're just not just controlling, what they're doing. You got to control what they're probably going to try to do, right? Opponents don't just come in and have like one set game plan. They adjust, usually the good ones always adjust, and you have to find some way to maintain that control. You're always one step ahead of your opponent. And I think what was it? Piotr Jan versus Jimmy Rivera was a pretty good one to look at. Like initially Jan was doing great. He's coming forward, he's pushing Jimmy back, and then Jimmy came back, and I think in the second round, was it? I think he came back and he started pushing Jan back, and Jan had to readjust. Right? I think that what makes a good fighter is a fighter that understands the game that he's playing and the game his opponent's playing. That means the fighter usually has to be pretty well read, which is why I wouldn't classify Cerrone as a good fighter, just because he doesn't come in with a game plan that can adjust to, what's going on. He just comes in expecting the same thing. And that's why I don't consider Cerrone a good fighter. I would call him a competent fighter or an exciting one. But in terms of actual games plan and actual skills and abilities, I would not call Cerrone a good fighter.
It's a spicy take.
I love him, but at the same time, he never does anything to change his game, per opponent. He does it, over a long stretch.
It's more common than you think for people listening. Like, there are a lot of guys, even at high levels, who are very good at playing their game. And then the second that there's like a wedge thrown in their game, they cannot adjust for whatever reason, or they just can't hang in their opponent's fight. Like, I mean, the example that comes to mind was Dustin Poirier against Khabib. Like, going into that fight, Poirier looked fantastic in terms of his skill set, in terms of how far he came, and a lot of the tactical things he was doing. But thinking about it, how much of that was the fact that his opponents, Pettis, Gaethje, Alvarez, and even Holloway to some extent, were allowing him into a fight that was the kind of fight where he was comfortable. Because the second that he had to fight someone who was offering a completely different threat, he virtually imploded. I mean, like, that's an interesting topic right there.
I think the number of fighters who are versatile enough to be able to handle both, Justin Gaethje and Khabib Nurmagomedov with like equal amounts of comfort is very, very low. Because because every fighter, and this isn't like something that's a criterion for a good fighter or a bad fighter, every fighter has their comfort zone, right? And it's hard to find a fighter who's just versatile across every phase. Like, there's a place where they want to be, and if anything, that's better, because if they're equally comfortable in every phase, that means they're not particularly good in any phase, because there's just not enough hours in the day to become elite everywhere, unless you're like Jose Aldo or Edward D'Artagnan. So I think the example that I use for like a fighter who I wouldn't expect to be particularly versatile might be, and this is a name that I bring up often for various reasons, Michael Johnson, because the Barboza fight is one of the few examples where I can find a fighter who isn't like certifiably elite all the time fight against type for an extended period and actually do it well. So I think like going in, I expected Poirier to do better, but I think it's kind of harsh on fighters to like judge whether they're good or not on whether they're able to fight someone who's kind of not who they're built to fight. Like it's weird to say because there are fighters who are built like to have success, but I wouldn't expect them to be particularly comfortable.
I guess that kind of begs a different question then, because you then have to sort of evaluate if you're someone who is, as Julian put it, who's very good at fighting your fight, very good in their area, but may not be so good at adapting their approach in a broader sense, then how good do you have to be in your area for us to consider you good? And I'm saying like us to consider you good, like that's some kind of arbitrary standard, which it is. I more mean like to be like this sort of, to be a good functional fighter, how deep does your skill set need to go, even in the area where you're considered best? What do you guys think?
I honestly think that I think one of the better examples would probably be, I think welterweight, honestly, welterweight or middleweight. When you just look at those guys, I think middleweight, especially around the time, I think Weidman had just been finished as champ. I think it was a pretty good way to look at it. I think Romero was what we call like the wrestling freak, right? At the time, I think Romero was still a big takedown threat. If he takes you down, he's probably just going to finish you. And Jacare was a submission threat back when both of them still were athletically very gifted. And Weidman was sort of the takedown artist as well, kind of half striker, and Rockhold was like
at least like a pressure fighter.
Yeah, so they all kind of had their own games, and those were, at the time, is what I would actually call them, good fighters, because every fight you went into with these guys, you would have to specifically tailor your game plan, tailor your style to, somewhat negate what they were doing. Rockhold did a really great job, I think, against Weidman by, just spamming those body kicks. Turns out Weidman isn't very good at, stopping kicks for some reason, and Weidman also just, when he took him down, Rockhold actually had a lot of great things to counter that. Rockhold was fighting the hands. He knew how Weidman was going to get on his back. Like, these were things that he clearly prepped for. And I think that at that time period, you could say those four fighters were legitimately good fighters.
Yeah, I think you could raise questions on like the depth of Rockhold's game, and I think Rockhold's a good example of what I mentioned earlier, that a fighter is only as strong as like his central process, because a lot of what Rockhold did doesn't make sense if you look at the fact that his top game was the singularly best part of his game, because he didn't have a takedown game at all, and he pretty much relied on either his opponent being really dumb or getting a knockdown that he couldn't really guarantee to actually have his best skill set be actionable. So I think like by a couple of criteria, I think like it depends on what criteria I use to determine someone's good. Like to answer Danny's earlier question, I think an example, and this is something we discussed on an earlier episode, is Kelvin Gastelum, because a lot of what Gastelum does, it struggles against an opponent who just doesn't hang out in the range where he wants them to be. And that, like on its face, that's kind of what we'd consider a bad quote unquote fighter to be. But I certainly wouldn't consider him bad because where he wants to be, it's A, not particularly easy to avoid unless you're a certain kind of fighter, and B, he's ridiculously, ridiculously good in that range. So, I mean, I think a limited fighter can be a good fighter. You just need to be really, really good within those limits.
And I think that kind of like this is sort of what I expected from this discussion. I kind of figured that we just sort of spiral, and that creates another sort of interesting dichotomy, which is like, like at what point does that notion break down? Because as I've said to Sriram, much to his dismay, I'm pretty sure that I'd pick Yair Rodriguez over Kelvin Gastelum. I don't think Yair Rodriguez is a very good fighter, but he is athletic as hell. He's long, he's big, he's mobile, and he's at least gonna he'll kick Cater a lot, and ostensibly those things have always troubled Calvin Cater to the point where I don't know if Cater would be able to force his advantage on Yair Rodriguez. And I don't want to just make this about like that one specific matchup, but it's an interesting one to consider because you sort of have to kind of think about it, right? You have to think about like even in fighters, who we think are great, who we rate very highly, they might look surprisingly pedestrian against a specific kind of matchup.
Yeah, and I think that's just sort of like the nature of MMA, right? It's like, you're always going to have some sort of weakness, and there's always some guy that's going to have that one style that just completely trumps you, right? Like when we saw, I think, for the longest time, I thought Frankie Edgar was considered, a good fighter, even like a great fighter, because, his style just worked pretty much everywhere until somebody started low kicking him, and that was pretty much it. But you just never know. And I think that's just the hardest part and why we can't put a label on, good fighters in MMA.
What about the bad ones? Like what about fighters that we don't think are that good? Like what is it about them that we
Like Jose
dislike?
Aldo?
Yeah, like Jose Aldo is a very good example, Julian. No, but like seriously, I mean, fuck, we're probably gonna have to talk about him at some point. With since we're only like $150 away from this promise that I made. Daniel Cormier is probably a worthwhile example. John Jones, we talk about a lot of higher division guys. But like, who are guys that we maybe don't rate as highly as the masses do, and like, what is our criteria for disliking them or thinking less of their skill sets than some?
I think I'm going to bring this back to sort of like like when I say that MMA fans don't understand context. I think literally today I saw somebody, talk about how John Jones is changing up his rhythm and variety. And he had a gif of him, walking backwards and tagging Daniel Cormier. And DC did literally nothing to stop him. And I think if you put the word context into every single argument in MMA, you quickly disseminate, who is a good and just a generally bad fighter. John Jones isn't someone we would call good because everything he does contextually is given to him by his opponent. Like when we look at DC just sort of walks forward, plods forward, doesn't really do all that much to deflect kicks and punches, and DC just doesn't defend his body very well, right? I think when we look at context in MMA, it's the easiest way to sort of figure out who's good and bad.
Yeah, I agree. I think I said before that a fighter is only as strong as their process, and I think the important thing to that is that their process has to be tested. I'm going to bring up Woodley again because he's probably the most egregious example of this. Is that like, you have a really, really rear hand heavy fighter who's dependent on guys not really wanting to close him down. And if you look at every fighter he faced between Rory McDonald and Kamaru Usman, he faced guys who wouldn't really test that process. And that's what convinced people that he had overcome those flaws when his process wasn't really being tested. It was more just getting volume of a variety of good to great fighters who aren't really prepared to deal with what he brings to the table. So I think, I think another example could be Rafael dos Anjos in like a different way, because there are certain ways in which dos Anjos' process can be like hampered, right? Like there's the pressure wrestling of Kamaru Usman, Colby Covington. There's the length of guys like Leon Edwards and Tony Ferguson. But fundamentally, he's going to have some success against those guys, with the exception of maybe Usman. But it's not. If something goes wrong with him, if his process is tested, it might not pass with flying colors. It might not pass at all, but it's not going to be embarrassed. So I think like delineating it between good and bad fighters is, I think it's kind of hard, because there's certainly some gray area there where good fighters have trouble with things that we might not expect good fighters to have trouble with. But yeah, I think that's kind of where I stand, is that it comes down to how strong their process is and whether we can see it being tested.
I like that a lot. And that goes back to a conversation that I had with Phil McKenzie a few months ago, which is that before, I mean, MMA fans like to declare stuff. They always, I'm sure, right? Like they always want to declare, like, who's the greatest or who's the best right now, or who's so underrated, or whatever the hell they want to talk about. But the thing is, Sriram, I think that's a great point. Is that you can't. It's hard to evaluate until you've seen it, and all you can really do is analyze what you've seen. And so like RDA is a good example because he's someone that we actually have a lot of tape on. Like we've seen him against pressure wrestlers like Colby Covington, and to a greater extent Kamaru Usman and Khabib Nurmagomedov. We've seen him against strikers. We've seen him against other grapplers. We've seen him against back foot boxers like Eddie Alvarez. Like he's someone who at least we can make a fairly good assessment of what he's good and bad at because we've seen him against a variety of different matchups. I think the hard part about evaluating fighters in MMA is that even as they start to rise, even as they get better, like you still don't kind of know how they react to a bunch of different matchups. And so
Yeah, I mean
I'm trying to think of a good example of someone who we sort of like. I mean, like Cody Garbrandt is probably a really good one because we saw him knock out a bunch of fairly nascent fighters, and then he fought Thomas Almeida, and it was like, oh wow, like he dusted that dangerous dimensional prospect very quickly, and then he fought Dominic Cruz later and just owned him. And was like, oh, I see. Like he's a counterpuncher. He can pivot. He can take angles. He's patient. Like I get it. Like we see his game. That might be hard against T.J. Dillashaw, and then we see him against someone who's willing to kick at him from range, who can feint him out, someone who can cover his entries and actually throw hard. Get him to ignore his positioning and actually just outposition him. And we've seen him just fall apart. And but we wouldn't have known that until we got there, right?
Yeah, it's the kind of thing where MMA fighters tend to have, like, especially at the top, they tend to have fairly short careers. And especially if you look at like how badly the UFC tends to manage the careers of pretty much every unranked fighter in the world at every weight class, it's just you're not going to see them against a variety of fighters who you consider are good, like good enough at what they do to make the styles matter. Like I think another good example might be Kelvin Gastelum, because I mean, to us maybe not really, but to a lot of people, like the struggle he had with Darren Till was really, really surprising. But for like if you look at how he deals with guys who are orthodox versus how he deals with guys who are southpaw, it's very different. And yet when he faced the guys coming up, it was just not guys who were prepared to deal with that weakness. So, yeah, it's bizarre because a lot of times a guy's process just isn't getting tested until you're confident in him, it's just the nature of the sport. It's bizarre.
Yeah, I still think what's his name? Magny. I think Magny would still be a terrible matchup for Woodley, just because we have seen Magny sort of tested. His process has been tested, against guys that are kind of similar to Woodley to a degree, especially in this stage where I don't think that Woodley has the confidence to come forward anymore. I think a guy like Magny, who is, just ranked super low now, will probably just decision him, like he decision Gastelum.
I mean, it kind of goes back to what Danny said about Kattar versus Rodriguez, is that I'm not sure where the limits of where Woodley's incompetence lies in terms of like how good the guy has to be. Because like if you ask me, like James Vick, he probably isn't going to beat Woodley just because he's fragile and his defense is awful. But then if I say someone who just keeps a jab in Woodley's face probably beats him, you'd be like, hey, Vick kind of fits that. So like Magny, his defense is bad, and I think it'd be one where he looks good until he loses. But you've got I'm not sure whether Magny is good enough at what he does to make the style matchup matter. And that's kind of the struggle that we have in picking fights.
I think that's a bit of an overestimation. I mean, I think Woodley at least has insane closing speed and has a wrestling threat, which as limited as they are against certain kinds of opponents, like there are people who will just not be able to get out of the way fast enough. And I feel like Magny and Vic are probably guys who would just find themselves in the line of fire too often. But I agree with the premise. I think that that's kind of I think that's part of the reason why Woodley was so frustrating for a lot of us was that it wasn't just how he fought, but it was the fact that he didn't really answer a lot of the questions that his opponents asked so much as he just ignored them. And that was annoying to watch because what analysts knew was that, okay, none of these guys are asking the right questions. None of them are setting a pace on him. None of them are taking the initiative. None of them are, flashing feints, are throwing a jab. None of them are walking in on him and, getting into the clinch and just fucking him up. Like, he's just able to ignore the questions of a lot of opponents because they're not asking them the right way. They're not he can afford to eat a bunch of sidekicks from Stephen Thompson because Thompson's never going to build on any of them. He can afford to hang back and fight in one of the lowest paced fights ever against Damian Maia because Maia's never going to be able to take him down. But then the second that Kamaru Usman was just like, I don't think this guy's very good in the clinch. I'm just going to walk in on him. Like, Woodley's bolt was shot. And so when you evaluate like the quote unquote goodness of a fighter, I think you need to evaluate not just their ability, like not just what they do, but their ability to answer the questions in front of them, not to ignore them. And I think I had to make the point at some point. That is one of the main reasons why I hate Daniel Cormier, and I always will. It's because he is not someone who is tactically or strategically capable of answering the questions of his opponents. He just ignores them. He just believes in his heart of hearts that all I have to do is just keep pushing my game harder and harder and harder, and eventually I will win. I will get my fight and I will win. And the great thing about his losses to Jones and, to a lesser extent Stipe, was that those guys prove that no, that's not how that works. Eventually, you're going to just either soak up too much damage on the way in, and you don't have any ability to take away the weapons of your opponents, and you're not invincible. Eventually, you are not going to be able to just ignore whatever's coming back at you and just force your game. Eventually, you're going to have to adapt, and he cannot adapt at all.
Yeah, I think that's the big indictment I had about the guys who Woodley was facing. Is that a lot of Woodley's game was Ryan said this a while ago, and I think it's the best way to describe Woodley's game is that he's not letting people who don't want to get close get close. That's pretty much all he does. Is that against guys like Thompson who didn't really want to be in the pocket with him, Woodley just kind of pretended that Thompson was trying to get into the pocket to just like launch that one counter he had. But the indictment on Thompson's part was that he couldn't figure out how to unravel a game that was so fundamentally simple. And I mean, simplicity isn't a condemnation in itself, but so easy to break down as both. It was shown before that and after that. I think the answering questions thing is the big criticism I have of Thompson in that fight and of Darren Till. And I mean, less so of Maia, because I'm not sure he ever had the athletic tools to deal with Tyron Woodley, especially given what he does well. But it's that if your process can't handle a guy who's that simple to deal with, it's hard to consider it a particularly strong one. Daniel Cormier is another good example because I think Cormier, he's a good example of the distinction between a good fighter and an effective fighter. Because I mean, most of the guys that we say, hey, they're not that good, and everyone argues with us, they're effective fighters. They're guys like Daniel Cormier or John Jones who have something that sets them apart from the pack, regardless of how good they are at fighting based on our criteria. But Cormier, he's not a creative fighter. He's not a particularly sound fighter. He does what he does, and what he does isn't good, but it works. And that's kind of the annoying part about trying to decide whether a fighter is good or not, is that sometimes they win despite themselves.
Yeah, I think I really like that. What do you guys think about calling Ferguson a good fighter?
Our opinions changed drastically after we had a conversation with Haxerized.
Yeah. I mean,
uh,
I would have called him good either way.
oh
It's
yeah,
just
oh of
the
course. What do
effectiveness
you
is
think,
what.
Julian? Because we kind of had our thoughts documented when we talked with Haxerized, who brought us on the Ferguson as a great fighter train. But what's your opinion? Because I think you brought him up for a reason.
Yeah, I think Ferguson is, like an actually good. I don't know if I would call him great, but I certainly think he's really great. Really good fighter. Mostly just because, like what Sriram said, like how has his process been tested, and his process, has actually been tested pretty well. He's fought pretty much everybody that's kind of different, right? I think he fought Rafael dos Anjos, he fought Michael Johnson, even though he lost. He lost. He fought Cerrone. He fought Pettis. He's fought wrestlers, strikers. He's fought literally everybody except for Khabib and Gaethje, and he's sort of shown that he can change what he's doing, and he can find a way to do different things. But in terms of calling him good, I would just say that Ferguson has all the showings of what a good fighter should be, but he just tends to get in the way of himself. Like he brings in tools for every single fight that's different, but he's just sometimes too stubborn to just lay back on those tools.
I think that's a really good example to think of, because one of the things that Haxerized said that made me really kind of reconsider Ferguson is the fact that he said there are some fighters like Khabib where if you give them a specific matchup, they will literally look like a fish out of water. Tony Ferguson, on the other hand, is someone who fundamentally understands fighting and winning, and you could put him, some version of him at pretty much any division. You could put him at middleweight, you could put him at heavyweight, you could put him as a flyweight. He might not have the same record, he might not go on the same streak, but he's someone who understands like how to win fights in a broad sense across all divisions, and that counts for a lot. But I think that there's also, with that kind of broad brush stroke that you paint Ferguson with, you also have to look at it as a more minute one. And I think that's a really apt way of saying it, is he just kind of gets in the way of himself. He occasionally just doesn't set up his strikes for whatever reason. He doesn't really have a consistent method to counterattack. He's pretty careless with his distance early, and it often gets him in really, really bad trouble. I think that's a great way to say it.
Yeah, I used to think that Ferguson before was actually a much better counter striker. I think early in his game, he didn't necessarily get hurt that cleanly before. I think mainly because he was much more of a slip and rip kind of counter striker. And after he started doing so well, he started realizing, oh, I'm physically gifted as well. I can just keep pushing the pace, and these guys will break. And the slip and rip thing, let's forget about it. And I think if he brought that back, he would be a very different fighter. Mainly because I think that because he spent so much time trying to be a slip and rip artist, he sort of learned, oh, I can put in one or two different little things, and this will get me what I want, and this will get me to where I need to be. But eventually, he just sort of went, I can just do whatever I want, really, and guys will break.
I think the question that Ferguson raises is, what does your process failing entail? Because I think it doesn't have to be losing. I think that's why a lot of us have a bit lower estimations of Ferguson than, I mean, at least before the episode we had with Hacks, is that for a fighter who's built the way he is, he didn't necessarily have the success against guys like Cerrone and Pettis, for that matter, Lando Venata, that he maybe should have. So, like, would I say a pressure fighter not completely wrecking Cerrone inside the first round, would that be a failure? And I kind of want to say yes, because pretty much everyone else who's kind of nominally played that same sort of game, at least philosophically, that Ferguson does, they've kind of just destroyed Cerrone inside a round. So if you look at it that way, you could say that Ferguson's process isn't as reliable as it should be for a top fighter. And just like, for Lando Venata, it's just, how do you deal with a guy who's just not particularly good at anything but ridiculously dynamic to a point? And he didn't look great. It's just that he found a way. And I think I think that kind of also brings up the different criteria that we're using, because his process isn't as reliable as we want it to be for a good fighter, but he answers questions and he answers them well, at least with the opponents that we've seen so far.
Then that makes an interesting question also, which is how do we try to say this right? How do we evaluate fighters who maybe aren't the deepest in terms of their skill set, but have a willingness to their skill set? Because we can pick apart a lot of the things that Ferguson does that are not technically standard or even sound. But he plays them well, and he works off his threats consistently. Another fighter that comes to mind is someone like Henry Cejudo, who is also not a very polished technician at all, but has shown a strategic sensibility, has shown a willingness to improve tactically, and who is just, incredibly dynamic and fearless.
I mean, yeah, I think you evaluate Cejudo higher than the rest of us broadly do, and that's kind of. I think it's fair how you evaluate him, because, as you mentioned in your metagame piece, and I think in the Cejudo piece too, initiative is something that we fault a lot of fighters for, and that's something that Henry Cejudo has in spades. I think the thing that I would say about Cejudo is that he fulfills the answers questions part of this set of criteria pretty well. It's actually genuinely impressive how he came back against Marlon Moraes when he got his leg chewed up, and in response, he shortened his stance, he marched forward, he jabbed him up and right-handed him up. He found what advantage he had against Marlon Moraes, and that was speed, and he just didn't let Moraes off the hook. But I think we could go back to the criteria that we used at the beginning, and we could say, if we put Henry Cejudo's game on a fighter, if we put Henry Cejudo's game on Alex Morono, would it work? Even with his intelligence and with all the skills that he has in wrestling, would it work? And I would have to say no. So I think the criteria that we've set aren't exactly contradictory, but it's going to lead to a bunch of different answers.
Yeah, I think I more or less agree with what Sriram said. I don't value Henry Cejudo that high. I think Danny, is one of Cejudo's bigger stands. I generally dislike watching Cejudo, but even then, I do have to say that so much of what makes Cejudo great is just the fact that he just believes that he's the better athlete, and he genuinely is against most opponents, if not all of his opponents. That he just will come forward. He just knows, if I take a hit, I can probably still keep going, and if I hit my opponent, they probably can't take it as well. And I think that just goes a long way. But I guess what what Sriram said, it's just very hard to classify fighters who are just so athletically gifted that they can throw away some of the more finer points of technical fighting.
We get lost in that sometimes. I think we get lost in the technical discussion a bit. And we sometimes just forget to look at basic effectiveness. And that's one of the things that I'd point to. I mean, all scoring discussion aside, because that's really not what we're here for. But if you look from the first Demetrius Johnson fight to the second Demetrius Johnson fight, I don't know how anybody can look at those two fights and say that Cejudo hasn't greatly improved as a technical, strategic, and tactical fighter. And I think that we sometimes get bogged down in that sort of discussion in terms of depth, that basic sense of strategy and tactics can often, and I've written about this in the past, can often override those traditional skill gaps where they might exist. I mean, the instinct in me to take umbrage with your point, Sriram, is that I don't know how many fighters you could scale down and put in the body of Alex Morono and expect them to do well. I don't know if, could you scale down the skill set of Israel Adesanya and put it in the body of Alex Morono and expect it to do well? Because I wouldn't.
That's a good point. But
I
think it's kind of like the level of success I'd expect. That makes sense.
I hear you. I do. I just think that that may be a pretty extreme example, but in general, I like the idea of I like the idea of taking away the sort of big athletic elements of a fighter, but one element that I don't think gets mentioned quite as much, and this is a bit of a nebulous one, but it's worth discussing, is confidence. Because Henry Cejudo, and I like talking about as a fighter. I think he's really interesting. Is a fighter who, when he builds and brims with confidence, he is a force. And I think that you can have guys, who are more traditional sort of technicians, maybe erode a bit when their confidence gets hit because they're just less willing to initiate. They're not as sure about their distance. I mean, Tony Ferguson is another example of a guy who's just, I think we're starting to see Ferguson's confidence erode a bit as he's getting older. And I think that's natural. I'm not trying to fault him for it, but I think it's an important one. If you look at his fight with Cerrone, it looked like he was slower. Not just slower in terms of his body, but slower in his ability to throw, slower in his ability to react, slower in his ability to find the openings, to create the openings. And that's as such, I think he's automatically a less effective fighter as a result. So, I mean, what do you guys think about when I say the broad, nebulous term confidence, what does that speak to?
Yeah, I think the best example might be one that you mentioned in your Cejudo piece also, which was Rafael dos Anjos. If even if he has some success in an area where he's good against a pressure wrestler, like he had some success early in exchanges against Usman, for example, it's just not going to work out for him, and you feel it when he's in there with a bad matchup. It's just he's not the kind to pull a fight back. And that was clear against Chiesa too. Like as soon as you saw that he was getting wrestled a bit, you're like, oh man, this is out the window. Even if it's a fight that he should have won, or he should have been able to win, rather. And yeah, where the alternative for RDA is if you look at a fight like Pettis, where if his confidence is on the rise, or if he's feeling good about the guy he's facing, he's like a truck downhill with no brakes. And I think it's an important thing to mention. I'm not sure it falls under the bucket of athleticism, but I think it's another kind of intangible that doesn't necessarily fall in the bucket of skill. I don't really know how to gauge it in terms of being good, because there are fighters who are confident and not good. Daniel Cormier is one that you mentioned, in that his confidence is the thing that makes his badness work, but it's still badness. Julian, what do you think?
Yeah, I think when we look at confidence, I think we can look at it in a specific context. Again, I think confidence in your process is what defines a particularly good or a somewhat competent fighter. I think when you see fighters, I think I draw from the big example like Conor McGregor. When he sees that his process is being sort of shaken, I think you can just see him it's almost like a switch. He just sort of turns off his confidence and he just sort of hides in a hole. We saw that against Diaz. We saw it against Khabib. When his confidence is shaken, he just completely shatters. But I think also fighters like Matt Brown, who just sort of, I love Matt Brown, but Matt Brown doesn't come in super confident. He always comes in kind of like a touchy-feely, and then he has to get sort of beaten into being confident. I think you have to look at, how does this fighter sort of build confidence? I think for Matt Brown,
The Cheeto Vera thing.
yeah,
Marlon Vera's the same way.
exactly. I think when you watch Matt Brown, he gets beat, and then for some reason he just thinks that, oh, I'm getting beat, I need to beat him back, and he just comes back. But then there are fighters like McGregor who absolutely has to stay on top no matter what, because if he loses that one exchange, all comes crumbling down. I think that confidence in your process sort of helps determine if you're a good enough fighter.
I think that's a good way to say it. I think composure is probably a good way to phrase that, because you can look at a fighter, that is an interesting way to consider it. Like you have someone like Stipe at heavyweight, who is probably the most composed heavyweight I've ever seen. Like, of the times that Stipe's lost, either whether it be caught out, it's never been because he's gotten hit and then he's just spazzed out. He's just freaked out, or he's mentally imploded. Like, he's he will keep enforcing his game. If it's a bad exchange, if it's a bad round, if he gets knocked down, if he gets hurt, no matter what, he will just keep pushing his game until he physically can't anymore. And like, I think the composure and confidence are slightly different. I think McGregor is someone who tends to, he sort of walks in, he sort of needs his confidence to keep his composure. And then you have a fighter like Justin Gaethje, who's just, his confidence and his composure are, seemingly tied, where he just doesn't, neither one really seems to erode. At the times that he's lost, it's been because he's lost to guys who were just, a little bit better than him that night. And so that's like, there's tons of value there. I mean, Daniel Cormier had no business beating Anthony Johnson, let alone beating him twice. If you look at their skills on paper and just in a broad technical sense. But it's that Anthony Johnson, the moment his confidence starts cracking, the fight's over. I mean, and he's such a fragile fighter in terms of his confidence. Even Phil Davis was starting to erode his confidence just by the fact that Phil Davis was still there after 3 rounds. Like, that was enough to make Anthony Johnson start shooting on weird takedowns, and Davis started working on a Kimura along the fence. Like, that, like, he is a perfect example of someone who is not composed, who you can never trust to, if he had, think about it, if he had a bad exchange against someone like Stipe, if Stipe was able to counter him and hit him with a right hand, just for the sake of argument, who's to say that wouldn't immediately shut Johnson's brain off, and he would suddenly be feeling, I can't win this fight. His confidence was wrecked, his composure, went out the window, and then that was it.
Yeah. Who was it? Oh, 1 second. I think the biggest fighter I think that actually like came back from that sort of confidence break was like Robbie Lawler. I think Lawler, sometimes you do see him like super dejected. I think against Hendricks, he like whenever he got taken down, you can just see his face just go from like, oh, I'm doing great, to, oh, this really, really sucks. I hate this so much. But like, he just keeps coming back. And I think that sort of played into what made him do so good. But that's also his biggest issue. I think he falls into that problem of, when you're first learning how to strike, some guys who want to be defensive strikers will often fall into a trap of just sort of taking shots and being comfortable being, defensive all the time and curling up. So there is some drawbacks to being too confident in your process. Sometimes you can just be way too defensive and just lose rounds because all you're thinking is, oh, I'm sticking to my process, I'm succeeding. And that's just not really the case. So even then, that sort of idea that being confident or having great composure in your process might not work so well.
I think it's that confidence can cover for a lot of those flaws, but it doesn't make them go away. I think that's kind of the thing that we had with Tony Ferguson with Hacks a while back, is that at his best, Tony Ferguson is just supremely confident in everything that he does, even if what he's doing is just traditionally really, really unsafe. Like, squaring up, moving forward, and flicking out these jabs that he isn't particularly responsible with. All that stuff, it matters in like the small scale, but it's just that when it comes to a fighter who's like a defined momentum or a defined confidence fighter, it's just there's a way that it doesn't really matter. So again, like I'm still kind of in the same place where I'm not sure where confidence comes in, because I kind of feel like it's more like a manifestation of goodness than it is like a component, if that makes sense. Like it's something that
Yeah,
can
that
cover
does.
for bad things, but it's not something that makes you good.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, the reason that I brought up confidence in regards to Henry Cejudo is because he was literally fighting Marlon Moraes with a sprained ankle and 3/4 of his left shoulder torn from like on pretty much the opening bell, like, and that he was still able to fight through that and win the fight the way he did. I think that speaks to insane composure. Someone who has competed, in athletic challenges at the very highest of levels. Someone who's been under that kind of mental pressure before, someone who understands what that feels like, and someone who can take, have a bad round and not let that impede their confidence. but I think that's a really apt way to say it, Sriram, is that like guys who are, you can be bad and confident, and you can be good and fragile, but like it's a component that can assist you as a fighter, but it doesn't define you. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Any parting thoughts on this? I'm sure we could probably go all day, but we probably want to keep this at least, fairly around an hour. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much all. I think Dariush is the best example because he's the best, and that's my parting thought.
Wow. Wow, pretty inspiring stuff there.
Gotta go
Julian,
with that.
please tell me you have something more interesting to say.
I mean, yeah, I think there's just so many factors into what makes a good fighter like good, and that's why we tend to struggle to sort of develop, sort of like a database or even like a category to sort of like put each fighter in. Like we can say, oh, this guy is, this style and that style. But then again, like we've seen that certain styles don't work against certain fighters. Fighters with the dumbest styles can sometimes just easily beat somebody, and it's just like, why? But I think what we can take away from this is that, good fighters always have a good process. Like they always have a logical process to what they're doing. What they do logically makes sense. And I think having a style that, is logically valid and has a logical process makes a good fighter. If you're doing something that's just generally illogical, you're probably not a good fighter. And that's why we tend to put DC in his little box of you're not a good fighter, because you have been shown that you have this big weakness, but you illogically keep doing the same thing and you keep losing the same way.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Like, I know people always quote, think it's quoted to Einstein that like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Like, I don't, I've heard somewhere that was misquoted, but when we're talking about MMA, that makes a lot of sense because you have like, if that is true, then Cody Garbrandt and Daniel Cormier are absolutely insane. Like that, there is no reason that you should be expecting a different outcome when you just keep doing the same thing again and again. That's probably a good parting thought, is that good
And
fighters.
sorry, Danny. I think based off of that, that's why we think Gaethje is actually a good fighter now, because I think he really like looked at his game plan and went, "Hey, I'm losing the exact same way. How can I change that?" And he did, and we can now call him an actually good fighter.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the right way to say it. Is that a good fighter's process always makes sense, and a bad fighter's process a bad fighter's process who succeeds tends to succeed a little bit in spite of themselves, or they tend to kind of fail upwards. So that pretty much does it for the Fight Sites MMA podcast. Julian, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for inviting me.
We would love to have you on again. This was great, and a banging discussion about a topic that I think is really interesting, that we get asked a lot. So shout out to Trayvon Coker for the question. Thank you. And Sriram and I will try to be back again next week to do another podcast. Who knows what it's about? Who knows going to be with us? But you know what? Quarantine keeps rolling. We're trying to be consistent. All right. Thank you all.
Something, again, delightfully esoteric.
I mean, that's what our listeners are here for. So anyway, thank you all. Good night.
Thanks for joining us.